Hey everyone, welcome to our first video about the cell membrane. You might remember from learning about parts of the cell, what is the cell membrane? Well, it's a protective barrier between the outside and the inside of a cell. It's semi-permeable, which means it controls what goes in and out. Think of it as this sounds like a funny reference, but maybe like the bouncer at a club. Doesn't let everybody in, let certain people in, kind of like the cell membrane, only let certain things into the cell. And it's so important that's found in every single type of cell. So you can see here in the picture, the cell membrane goes around all around the outside of the cell. And we're going to learn it's made of what we call a phospholipid bilayer, and that's a picture of that bilayer. So, some people refer to the cell membrane as a fluid mosaic model. So, fluid because it's like flexible and it can move, and the phospholipids kind of can wiggle in place. And it also has these little proteins inside and also cholesterol, and they can move and change positions. So, that makes it fluid. And it's like a mosaic. If you've ever studied mosaics in an art or a history class, mosaics are made up of different small pieces or parts. And you can see here in the cell membrane, the fluid mosaic model, that it is like a mosaic because there are many different parts. There's phospholipids, there's cholesterol, and there's different proteins. So, what is the whole point of the cell membrane? What does it do? Well, it does this thing called homeostasis. And homeostasis means to maintain a balance within the cell. And it's balancing how many sugars are there, how much salt is in or out of the cell, and how much water is in and out of the cell. And that is critically important, how much water is in and out of the cell. So let's talk more about the parts of the cell membrane, and then in the next videos we're going to talk about how it actually does that, maintaining a balance. And just keep in mind that word homeostasis, or maintaining a balance. All right, so how does it do it? It is what we call a selectively permeable or semi-permeable membrane, and it controls what can go in and out. So certain molecules can go in, but look, certain molecules get turned away. And these other large macromolecules sometimes get turned away from trying to go through the cell membrane. So it's semi-permeable. It would allow certain molecules in and out very easily, and not so much other molecules. Now, it's made up of three main parts, and I call them the big three. Those are phospholipids, which leads to why it's called the phospholipid bilayer, cholesterol, and proteins. And you can see all those parts here, but we're going to break this down and talk about each part. So, phospholipids form a bilayer around the cytoplasm, meaning a double layer, and there's two parts of each phospholipid. There's a phosphate head, which is right here. It's made of a phosphate, which has the element phosphorus in it. It is polar, just like water is polar, and it's what we call hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means that it loves water. The heads are totally comfortable being exposed to water. The tails, however, are made of fatty acids, which you've heard about fatty acids before when we studied lipids. So it is a lipid tail, and it is nonpolar, just like oil is nonpolar, meaning it doesn't really get along with water. And it's hydrophobic. If you have a phobia, you're afraid of something. So hydrophobic means afraid of water. So the tails do not like water. Next up, here's a little image that shows the phospholipid bilayer and how it forms a double layer. So all the way outside of the cell, the phosphate heads are touching, and all the way inside the cell, this would be the inside of the cell, these are more phosphate heads that are touching it. And in between the phosphate heads are the fatty acid tails that are hydrophobic, and they're kind of in the middle because they're hiding from water. All right, another big part of the cell membrane is cholesterol. And cholesterol is actually a type of steroid, which you learned is actually a lipid. So you can see why the cholesterol is okay with being next to the fatty acid tail, because it also is a lipid. And it holds the phospholipids in place, which then leads to improving the stability, making the phospholipid bilayer more stable, and reducing how fluid it is, making sure that it's not so loose and fluid that it would, kind of fall apart. So the cholesterol holds these phospholipids that are next to it right in place where they're supposed to be, and they can be found all throughout the phospholipid bilayer. All right, and then lastly, of the three big main parts of the cell membrane is proteins, and they help with transportation and communication. And they can move materials in and out of the cell and signal other cells that something's going on within a certain cell. And there are three main types of these proteins: integral proteins, which go all the way through the phospholipid bilayer, and then peripheral proteins, which are on one edge or another, and then glycoproteins, which have a little extra part to them. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So let's start with integral membrane proteins. So the integral membrane can also be called transmembrane, which means that they go all the way through the phospholipid bilayer. And they really help transport materials because you can see they kind of create an opening or a channel where materials could come through the protein to get into or out of the cell. And those are materials that might not otherwise be able to sneak past the phospholipids, so they can come through an integral membrane protein. So next we have peripheral proteins, and you can see there's an integral one here, but attached just to the edge, not going all the way through, is a peripheral membrane. And that's either on the outside of the cell or sometimes on the inside of the cell. You'll see a peripheral membrane protein. And they can be attached to integral proteins or not. They can be on their own, and they help a lot with signaling other cells, since they're on the outside, about what's going on inside of the cell, and also helping chemical reactions take place. So peripheral is on the slightly on the outside or on the inside. If you think about that, your peripheral vision is being able to see something that's kind of on the outside of your vision area. And so peripheral proteins are on the outside and possibly on the inside of the cell membrane. All right, last type of protein is glycoprotein. And this has a kind of like glycogen, a carbohydrate chain actually attached to it. So if you see something extra attached to the protein, that could be a carbohydrate chain, and that could make it a glycoprotein. And glycoproteins could be either peripheral or integral. And that carbohydrate chain is used to actually trigger chemical reactions that would take place within the cell. So here's a big picture of the cell membrane. We have our phospholipid bilayer. So you can see the phosphate heads in red, and the fatty acid tails are kind of an orangish color. You can see the carbohydrates in there to hold everything in place, and those are yellowish. You can see some integral proteins that go all the way through, like right here and right here, goes all the way through. They help with transportation and moving materials in and out. You can see where there's some glycoproteins. They have this little carbohydrate chain attached to them that makes them a glycoprotein that can help with cell signals. And you can even see some peripheral proteins, like right here, that does not go all the way through. It's just on one side or then another, and that's a peripheral protein, just like your vision just at the side of your vision is peripheral.